Hello dear colleagues and welcome to the Didactic Laboratory. My name is Feka and this channel is for those of us who are interested in teaching, pedagogical research, and where I share my experiences of working as an English teacher in Sweden. This video focuses mainly on the big perspective when it comes to teaching and to planning a course to create the annual plan or the unit plans that you might have ahead of you. This video will begin with the larger perspective, and successive videos in this series will focus more on the details. But today I'm going to start off by introducing who I am for those of you who are new to the channel, and then I will look more deeply into how to create the annual plan by looking at goals, but also how I distribute lessons. Welcome everyone. To begin with, I would like to introduce who I am. So my name is Fredrik, also known as Feke Norman, and I am a teacher who teaches primarily English and comparative religion in Sweden. I work at a upper secondary school. I've taught for around now about 13 years and so, and I also partially work as a quality coordinator. Now, I've always experienced the planning aspect of teaching incredibly interesting. But it wasn't always like that, since when I began teaching, I found that every single day was a struggle for survival. I had to come up with lesson plans, I had to come up with some, fascinating assignments for my students. So every single day, I struggled with trying to figure out what I was meant to do the upcoming days. And I always thought that this was something that I should have been taught when I was part of the teaching training program here in Sweden. Now, I found that it was difficult, and I've tried to collect all of those experiences that I've had over the years when then creating this channel. So I decided I wanted to create what I call the Didactic Laboratory, this channel where I can share my experiences, and hopefully some of you out there might find this useful. I really hope you do, and if you have any questions or if you have any things that I should add to the channel, please feel free to leave a friendly message below or just to contact me via email. But let's begin with looking at some of the larger perspectives when it comes to planning. As a teacher in Sweden, I always found it rather troublesome to find reliable sources when it comes to actually planning and knowing how to do that. When I began teaching, I had colleagues that kindly shared their various lectures that they've made. We had textbooks that we used, or we had, for example, shared tests. But what I found was that these actually rarely filled the entire year with lessons, and lesson plans were not quite that detailed. And I felt that I had to come up with lessons in between, and they actually composed the majority of my academic year, where I struggle with coming up with these ideas. And for example, if I used a textbook, maybe it just covered 2 or 3 lessons before it went on to the next chapter, and I felt that this was quite the fragmented way of teaching. And I've come to see that in research, it mentions that you should go more deeply into teaching a specific skill and getting students to become incredibly great at it before moving on, whereas I often experience that the textbooks the other way around. And that's when I try to really look back at the way that I've taught and the way that I've tried to plan and look at pedagogical research when I then plan the upcoming years. So when I made this video and when I've also made my plans, I've based it primarily on 2 sources that I will be linking to in the description of the video. And the first part that I want to talk about is a quote from 2 Swedish researchers called Håkansson and Sundberg. And this is my translation, where they quote, "Teaching is based and proceeds from goals and values that are guiding and ensure that the intended direction is maintained." Now, what do they actually mean by that? Well, as you can see the arrow below here, when a student begins taking a course, the idea is they're meant to develop knowledge and skills, right? And over that course, there will be different parts that they engage with, or some call them units. I prefer the word modules, since we don't necessarily need to teach them in a specific order. We can move them about. But in the end, the students are meant to have developed new knowledges and skills, right? That's the primary reason that we teach. We are going to begin with the goals related to the course that I'll be teaching. Now, this is the subject English, when we will look at the 5 goals that the National Agency for Education here in Sweden have defined are important to teach. And why do we start with these goals, right? We start with them because they are the guiding and they are in the ensuring factors that the intended direction of the course is maintained. Now, these are essentially like a compass, and they help me to create the syllabus and to make sure that I teach the right things. Now, this might seem like incredibly simple and basic ideas, but when I started teaching, I felt that I didn't really have the necessary toolkit to look at teaching from this larger perspective. Essentially, I looked at my lessons and how to make them engaging and interesting to my students, and I lacked the sort of seamless connection between different ideas that would help my students to get a larger picture. And I didn't really have that one either. It took me quite a while. And this is something that I've also understood that my colleagues also experienced, that the first year of teaching was incredibly chaotic, that they couldn't really quite grasp how they would distribute lessons and tests and how to work with them over time. Usually they had too many tests, which led to them being overworked with assessment and other sort of administrative tasks. And with time, and what research also tells us is that it's better to focus on a few assessment activities over time and instead spend a lot of time to develop in between. So I'm going to share some of the ways that I work with this and how I have decided to look at planning from the very first part of when I create my course. The first of them is that the students are meant to be able to understand spoken and written English. They are meant to develop the ability to use different language strategies. Then the ability to express and communicate in English in speech and writing, to be able to adapt the language to different purposes, and finally the ability to discuss and reflect on living conditions, social issues, cultural features, and so on, where English is used. And I want to begin here because these are the primary goals of the course that I'm going to be teaching. This is upper secondary school, and naturally there are many other details here that I haven't added, which are parts of the core contents. We will look at them in a later video, but this is a great starting point since it gives us an idea of what we're exactly meant to do. I'm supposed, through my teaching, to give my students the opportunity to become great at these 5 different parts, or these 5 goals. But if we look at it at a slightly more deeper level, we can see that each of these units or modules are meant then to include sets of lessons. Now here I visualize that by these boxes, and when I plan my course and look at these goals from a larger perspective, I try to split them into these units or these modules. And since I teach in Sweden, we have a academic calendar that might look a little bit different from what it's like for you who teach in other countries or at other kinds of schools for that matter. But what I do is I try to look at the amount of lessons that I have throughout the year in order to make sure that I can accommodate all of those 5 goals. So what I do generally is that I look at the calendar that I have at school, and then I count the lessons. So I look at each individual week, how many lessons I have, and then I have a rough plan of what it might look like. Now, here's an example of that, and this is based on this academic year, which begins now in August. So what I've done then is I've looked at each individual week, I've counted the amount of lessons that I will have, and then I've spread them out throughout the year. And in my case, I teach twice a week, so 2 times, and each lesson is then 80 minutes. And then I have obviously more of them since I have several courses that I teach. But as you can see here, what it gives us is a bit of an overview of how many lessons I can put back to back in relationship to the academic calendar. In my case, I'll walk you through it. We'll see that the school begins in week 34, so in August then. What I usually do is I have a course introduction where I tell my students what the course is all about, but also at my school we have various tests at the beginning of the academic year where students test their writing skills and their speaking skills and their receptive skills and so on, in order for me as a teacher to get an idea of where their skills are at. This helps me to plan the rest of the year, which we'll look into deeply later on, where we will look at the details, okay? But those are the first 2 weeks, so week 34 and 35. And after that, we have our first module or unit, which is going to be then between week 36 and week 42. This nets me about 12 lessons throughout that period. As some of you might have noticed, there are spaces, there are additional weeks that give me the opportunity to be a little bit more flexible, because sometimes some lessons disappear due to field trips, or let's say there's a holiday or something else that happens that I'm not in control over. So the idea is that we don't have to exactly have a full 6 weeks for a module. We might add a week here and there depending on what it looks like. After that, you can see that there's a green box at week 43. Here, what we do at my school is what we have something known as the anchor test, which is an old national test that all students take, and then teachers assess all of the tests anonymously. So we don't know what teacher assessed what test, and we don't know which student wrote the test either. And then we hand them back to give the students a bit of an idea of what the national tests might look like, but also as a group, as a collective of teachers, we then work together and we become even better at assessing. So it's part of a collaborative effort, but also to ensure that students get some rigorous feedback halfway into the autumn term. After that, week 44, we have a week of holidays, which is around Halloween. And then from week 45 until week 51, we have another set of 12 lessons, the next module in my planning. And then after that, we have Christmas and the Christmas holidays. And then week 2, our spring semester begins. Yet another 12 lessons until then week 9, where we have yet another holiday, which is called the sports break. And then you can see that we have 12 lessons between week 10 and week 19, which is the final module. Now, this module is a little bit special since you can see that there are these 3 green weeks as well. Now, during these weeks, we have national tests. So tests that all students who study English are meant to take as a part of the curriculum on a national level. And then week 15, we have the Easter holidays. So what happens there is that I teach a few lessons, and then occasionally we have a national test that I have to look at instead. And then eventually at week 20 until week 23 is the very final part of the course. Maybe we have some time to mop up any things we've missed, and then eventually students will receive their grades. And I think this sort of planning helped me immensely as a teacher when I began teaching. As I mentioned, when I started, I often felt that I had to plan every single day for the next day. But here what I do generally is I create this sort of modular overview, which means that during, for example, between week 36 to 42, I focus on some of the skills that I've talked about earlier, the goals, and then I swap to other goals during, for example, then week 45 to 51. And what that gives me then eventually is this sort of annual wheel that we have now in picture. And as you can see here then, we begin in August. And what I usually do is I look at the goals that I mentioned earlier. We talked about to adapt the way you use language, the receptive skills and speaking and writing and so on, but I match them. And what that means is that I focus specifically on a few skills at a given time. Let's say that this year, when I teach English, I give my students the first module, which will then focus on listening and speaking. So we train our listening skills, and then we talk about the various topics that we engage in. And then after that, when we come to module number 2, we then focus on other skills, which in this case would be reading and writing. Discussion and adapting and the strategies and so on are also built into these. And then this sort of carries on when we then reach spring. Since then, once again, I can repeat then the same idea or the general idea for the module during module 3, where we can once again then cover listening and speaking, and then finally cover reading and writing during module number 4. And then finally the national tests cover all of these skills. And what this gives me then is a great opportunity to work both formatively and in a summative way, which means that I can assist my students in helping them grow and giving them formative feedback throughout the year, and then I can test it several times. So let's say, for example, when I began teaching, I might have just randomly put these ideas together, you know, having a textbook, maybe having a grammar lecture here and there, and then, you know, these didn't really connect that well. We'll look deeper into this in the next video when we will be talking about something known as constructive alignment and how I work with this these days. But the core idea is that my students are meant to practice and develop and become better at each of these skills at least twice, which means that the feedback that they receive during autumn will help them to grow once they then engage in the same skills and knowledges during spring. So they have several times to practice, to grow and develop, since they eventually will receive their grades once they have taken the national tests, and I as the teacher put the final grades together and so on. But this ensures that I as the teacher then have given them several opportunities to develop and to learn. To summarize, this video has introduced a little bit about what I do as part of this channel, the Didactic Laboratory, where I try out things in my classroom and I share my experiences with you teachers out there. We also then talked a bit about how to plan the syllabus from a larger perspective, specifically from a goal and lesson perspective, where I shared how I look at the goals that come with my syllabus and how I distribute them over time. I then showed how I work with the annual calendar that we have at my school and how I split these lessons over time and distribute them to create modules of 12 lessons to ensure that I have enough time to teach my students and to make sure that we can repeat certain key skills over the academic year. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this interesting, you can message me by giving the video a thumbs up or leaving a friendly comment in the comment section below. If you have colleagues that might find this interesting, please share the video with them. And if you find the content that I share interesting, please consider to subscribe to the channel. It helps me immensely to grow, and hopefully others might find it as well. Now, in the future videos, I'm going to go into planning more deeply, where I share how I exactly construct learning objectives and the various sort of activities that we engage in during classes. So I hope you'll join me once again in the future. And finally, once again, thank you for watching.